Invincible Season 2 is not good. Invincible Season 2 is fantastic. Invincible Season 1 had a few issues, notably in like Episode 7, stuff with Omni-Man and Cecil, but it was still a great season of television, with great animation for the most part, interesting characters and plot lines, great music, acting performances and pacing, and all of those things remain true in Season 2. But I gotta say, I think it absolutely surpassed the quality of the first season. So without further ado, let's get into this video. So episode 1 starts off with an alternate dimension where Mark joined his father in taking over Earth, and this foreshadows not only a piece of Mark's internal conflict in this season, but it also foreshadows one of the antagonists that will appear later in the show. And one other detail I like from this is that in this version of Mark's mind, he doesn't like killing people, but he gaslit himself into thinking that the people resisting are the reason they are dying. And Mark paralyzes Adam Eve to, quote, go visit her, and I think it's interesting that he treats her like this because it feels like a callback to when Omni-Man called Debbie a pet, and now, Mark is kind of treating Adam Eve like that. In the beginning of season 1 of the show, Mark desperately wants to be strong, to be like his dad. Seeing him on TV and being sad, getting bullied at school, working a bad job and not spending much time with his friends so that he can afford comic books, he wants that kind of life, but when that power is granted to him, he's over anxious, naive, and impulsive about things, and he slowly learns throughout the suffering, responsibilities, and reality that comes with this kind of life. He learns not to see things and people in black and white. And in season 2, it quickly starts to establish the things that Mark is struggling with after season 1. PTSD, feeling inadequate as a hero and feeling responsible for all the death and destruction from season 1, and being afraid that people will not only see him as his father, but also that he himself is scared of becoming his father. And he feels like he needs to be out there repaying things. He wanted to be like his dad before, and now he's feeling fear and stress to show people and himself that he's not. And then, after the explosion kills everyone in the Maulers and Angstrom fight, Mark still feels responsible for everyone's death. And what both Cecil and Amber try to communicate to Mark in this episode is that these things aren't his fault, and that he doesn't have to blame himself for everything. We also see Debbie struggling with life after what happened to Nolan as well. She's trying to be strong for Mark, but she's struggling with being strong for herself. But at the end of the episode, we see the creation of Angstrom's motive to go after Invincible. His initial experiment was to give himself the ability to save lives across the entire multiverse with subsumed intelligence and knowledge gained from his other selves. But when Mark is the reason this goes wrong, the other memories in his head cause his motive to go after Mark. And while I think Angstrom was good in this show, I do have a couple issues with the basis of him becoming a villain in this episode. The first thing is, why did Angstrom decide to do this experiment in a place where Cecil could possibly stop them? The only defense that I've heard against this is that he needed a place with a lot of energy to pull off the experiment, and that's a fine defense in like this dimension. However, I still think it's pretty contrived that there's no other dimensions that they could have pulled this off in safely. 2, why did he send the Maulers out to get the tech where they can easily be tracked, which would have an even higher risk of his experiment going wrong? And 3, if pretty much all the other Maulers outside of one and all the other Angstroms were killed by this explosion, then Angstrom should have been vaporized from this as well. He was literally at the epicenter of the blast, so he shouldn't even be alive right now. So the basis of his villainy kind of comes from really bad cause and effect, and this is one of my 3 issues with this season, and I think it's the biggest issue that the season has. However, given what we get from it, I'm willing to excuse it a bit. The only defense I can think of for this is that maybe this Angstrom just had a higher durability than the others, because he's the only Angstrom with powers. However, it doesn't really establish that he has this kind of durability to tank this, so at the very least, I'll just say, in good faith, maybe he has superhuman durability, but I think that should have been established beforehand. And I know people are gonna say, oh, well, he was taking hits from Mark at the end of the season, but that was because he had doctors that, made him stronger, and he says that later in the show. Then we move on to episode 2. I like the beginning of the episode speech that the principal gives. When you find yourself in the shadow of adversity, do not be afraid, for without adversity there can be no triumph. Without testing your limits, you will never know how strong you truly are, as it touches upon Mark's insecurity of feeling inadequate as a hero, and foreshadows things to come later in the show. We also have this unsettling moment with Mark and Darkwing's sidekick, where Mark stops playing around and it foreshadows the darkness within him.
Like you said, I'm Omni-Man's son. You have no idea what I'm capable of.
And I also like this moment where Mark's mom is trying to communicate to him that he doesn't have to keep trying to push himself, and she sees that he's worried about people seeing him as his father, and she tries to comfort Mark about this. And I also like this moment where this guy is treating his girlfriend like shit, and Debbie sees this and gets angry, saying she's not your pet, touching on what she feels about Omni-Man, and after this we see the rage within her as she struggles to grieve. And I like how this cabinet not closing and this mailbox also not closing kind of symbolizes like her not being able to close the door on like the grief that she feels for Nolan right now. And with the cabinet specifically, it kind of symbolizes how, like, the home is broken and it will never really be the same. And some of you may think I'm reaching with that, but it's I don't feel like it's just there for no reason. I feel like it obviously means something, and I think that something is what I just said. And then the final moment I want to talk about in this episode is when Mark tries to flee the combat trial in Atlantis because he's getting bodied by the creature that he's fighting, but then he sees that this causes people to die in Atlantis, and Cecil is trying to push him to stay away so that Mark doesn't die. But this is when we start to see a bit of growth from Mark, as he puts confidence in himself to not let people die like before. Then we move on to episode 3. In the beginning of the episode, where Mark's mom is telling him this is where he gets to figure out who he wants to be, as she drops him off as college, she as well starts to take steps in moving on. And I like the progress that Debbie starts to make as a person when going to this group talk, then going to the bar with this guy. Then she's told by this guy that Nolan killed his wife, Green Ghost, and she's hit with another wave of emotion. And when she's outside, she lets her feelings out and expresses that she can't grieve because Omni-Man isn't dead, he's just gone. And I like how this can be interpreted as her both worrying that he will come back, while also still missing that part of him, that good part of him that she remembers. The Alan part of the episode was enjoyable. I really like the world building it gives, and Alan is just a fun character. And when Alan died, I was genuinely sad. But after this, Mark meets Nawalzad, and he asks to help his planet from the meteor showers. Mark says that he can't because of missing classes, but I think it's really because he feels obligated to stay on Earth because of what happened with his dad, and like he said to his mom in episode 2, the last time he did something on his own, half a city got destroyed. And him leaving is him continuing to grow past those fears, and I like the dialogue where he tells Cecil that he feels responsible for all the deaths that happened, and then he has a new chance to save billions of lives, and Mark takes the advice from his mom about listening to himself before listening to Cecil, and her other advice about figuring out who he wants to be moving forward, and Cecil tells him that his father was the same way, as a way to try and manipulate Mark, and Mark just thinks for a second as he flies away and he continues going on. But when arriving on the planet, he's met with the very thing causing him so much internal conflict. And this brings us to episode 4, where shit really starts to pick up in the show. Now that's not to say the first 3 episodes weren't that good. There was still interesting character work and plot lines going on, and I like how the show just lets us sit with the characters and it doesn't need to be that superhero stuff 24/7. Debbie is one of the most interesting characters in this show, and she doesn't even have powers. But everything during and after this episode had me so locked into what was gonna happen next. It got to a point where I stopped taking notes because I was just so locked in. But after what Omni-Man did in season 1, we see the aftermath of that. Nolan is broken, regretful, and lost. He's about to off himself until he sees a ship about to crash into the black hole, and he saves them and stays, hoping it can give himself a second chance to right his wrongs because he now feels like he has a purpose again. And this moment between him and Mark is fantastic. Mark venting all his frustrations onto his father as they're both emotional wrecks at this moment. And then we cut to Debbie as she also walks alone, lost, broken, and contemplating about offing herself as well, just like Nolan. And she goes to the graveyard pondering her thoughts about wondering why Nolan did what he did. And Nolan shows Mark why he brought him to this planet, because of Mark's little brother, and the impending threat of the other Viltrumites about to arrive. And I like this line of dialogue that Mark says to his father after venting his feelings. For the first time, he acknowledges that something isn't his fault. He doesn't blame himself for this situation that his father had just sprung on him, but it's also shown later in the episode that a lot of this was just said in anger, and that he does still want to help when talking to Andressa in the cave. But Mark letting those feelings out was interesting. And when talking to Andressa in the cave, she explains a bit more of Nolan's life and feelings in the time past since the end of season 1. Mark internally knows this, but what his father's done still hurts him. And during this, I like the dialogue as it conveys how much Nolan both cares for his family and how he knows what he's done is unforgivable, but as he sees the population being slaughtered by the other Viltrumites, Nolan gets angry at his own feelings. He's been brought up the majority of his life believing in a way of life that is almost completely wrong, and that way of life doesn't see the good in the elements of humanity, and his guilt is eating away at him. And I just love this, as he asks Mark, why do I feel this way? And Mark just replies, this is how you should have felt on Earth. And as Mark is getting his ass kicked, Nolan tells him that he needs to stop holding back and fight to kill, otherwise him, his brother, and everyone on this planet will die. And this is great foreshadowing for the end of the show, because at this point in the show, and before, Mark won't go that full mile, he won't use his full power in any other moments other than those short bursts of anger we can see. And when seeing all those dead Thraxans as he continues to fight, Mark stops holding back. And after winning the fight, he can't bring himself to kill her, which causes him to be badly injured, as well as his dad to be taken away for execution, as he's told that if he doesn't conquer Earth, then they will kill millions of people.
My books. Read my books, Mark.
And before I move on to episode 5, something that also comes from this is Debbie finally starting to move on as she tells Cecil to stop giving them money from Nolan's books, and she donates his things away. And now this brings us to episode 5. In the beginning of this episode, Mark again starts to blame himself for what happens to the Thraxans, and I like the words that he gets from Andressa here, where she tells him, in our culture, we don't assign blame, we only look forward. And so Mark, just like on Earth, feels obligated to stay here and help the Thraxans rebuild. And Nualza and Andressa tell him they will be fine and that he should go back to Earth to help them. And Andressa asks Mark to take his brother, due to not wanting the kid to suffer through years of loss, reflecting on how Nolan felt with Mark. But she trusts Mark to guide his brother through and take care of him. And I really like this moment. When going back to college, we see this moment between Mark and Amber, where she tells him the things that went on and what she's been struggling with while he's been gone. And while I didn't think Amber was as bad as other people did in the first season, I definitely liked her a lot more in season 2. She's a lot more understanding of what Mark is going through, but it's also hard for her, having to lie to people, dealing with everything on her own and feeling lonely. They made her both a more interesting character and a more likable one as well. And it's as well just another scene that touches upon Mark's dual life balance struggle. Then we get this conversation between Eve and Mark that also touches upon this, where he tells her how he feels bad leaving Eve, his mom, and Amber, and this also touches upon the aspect of Mark putting all this blame onto himself. But there is one problem I have with this episode, and that's how they don't ask the Martian that's with them for any information on the warship that they're about to board until they're like right next to it. This is pretty stupid. It doesn't really change anything about how the plot would play out, so I don't think it's a big problem, but it's still a problem nonetheless. Now we move on to episode 6. I first want to talk about an issue that I have with this episode, which just so happens to be my only other issue with the show, and it's Rex surviving this bullet to the head. Now, this criticism is a little bit iffy for me, because on one hand, Rex does have superhuman durability, like obviously, given what he's able to survive like throughout like season 1 and this season, but on the other hand, he still gets damaged by the bullet, and it still penetrates his skull. So at the very least for now, I'll just say it's convenient that the bullet didn't kill him. But another thing I don't really like about this is how none of these characters actually die. Like, I can accept Kate coming back later in the show and Rex coming back, but they could have at least killed like bootleg Ant-Man girl. She has like 5 minutes of screen time in the entire show, so like why not just kill her? But I'll still say that I like how the show has programmed me into the stakes of every fight because of season 1. So it did actually make me think in the moment that all of these characters are actually dead. So props to the writers for that. But anyways, I really like the scene between Amber and Mark and how they've spent so much time away from each other that they barely even know what to talk about and kind of feel awkward around each other. And Mark remarks that he kind of just wishes he never got powers so that he could just live a normal life. And Amber expresses how she has nobody to talk about with anything, and she knows Mark's obligations and she loves that about him, but it's just hard for her. And this moment is the start of their relationship kind of starting to crumble. And in the next scene, Mark expresses to Rex, what is it about being a superhero? We save lives but ruin our lives at the same time. And right after he sees Eve, I like how this kind of foreshadows the feelings that he has about her, but he's kind of just brushing them away because he's not ready or too scared to get closer to her right now because of the things going on in his life. And this transitions into Amber talking to Eve and Mark talking to Art about their relationship and everything that's going on between them. Both of them expressing how him being invincible takes a toll on not only their lives, but also their relationship, them both feeling like they're failing each other, and Amber doesn't want to express all her feelings because she feels bad putting that onto Mark, and Mark hates leaving her all the time because he knows how it makes her feel, and it reminds him of how it was with him, his dad, and his mom. And they both aren't talking to each other about this because they aren't comfortable talking to each other about this right now. Most likely due to the fact that these kinds of conversations, laying out everything on the table and possibly not finding a solution, can lead to a breakup or cause the rift in their relationship to grow even more. And neither of them want that, but they just need someone to talk to. And Mark also expresses to Art how he's feeling about his dad and how he still misses him. And I like the line from Art where he says, "It makes you human." And when seeing that his dad put things in his books that could help against the Viltrumites, this makes him happy because it's a spark of good in his dad. Now granted, what his dad did is still unforgivable, but it's his dad, so of course he's gonna struggle with feeling just completely unempathetic for what happened. Next, Alan comes to Mark offering to bring him to his boss, Optimus Prime, because they want to meet Mark and have him join the army. But Mark won't go because of all the stuff that he has to deal with on Earth, his mom, being a hero, Amber, and his little brother. And I like how by the end of the scene, it shows how Mark will still be there when the real fighting actually starts. And I also really like this moment with Omni-Man and Sergeant Viltrumite guy, as he tries to sway Nolan into rejoining the forces due to him being one of their best, and trying to mentally break Nolan, and Nolan is just silent with nothing to say as this guy is trying to pry the humanity he has out of him. I think this is very well done. Then we move on to episode 7. In the beginning of this episode, Mark and Amber are at this Comic-Con, and Mark starts to get worried that Amber might be bored because he of course wants to make her happy with the little time that they get with each other. And she reassures him that as long as they're together, it doesn't really matter what they're doing. But then Mark needs to go save Rex, and he again has to leave Amber alone. Then when going to help Rex, I like this moment that parallels the two. After Rex recovers from his injury, he feels like he needs to get back out there and prove himself again after failing, just like Mark did at the beginning of the season. And as they talk quickly about how things are going with Amber and Mark tells Rex what's happening, and Rex tells Mark that he and the Guardians will take a couple days out of the week where they will cover for him so that he can spend time with Amber. And then we move on to this scene between Mark and his old principal, where he tells Mark words he needs to hear. I know how difficult it's been since your father passed, but you need to make a choice, Mark. If it's college, then commit to that. If it's not, then commit to something else. But make a decision. And Mark struggles to come to terms with this right now. He says he wants to stay at college with his girlfriend because that is what he wants. But internally, he's not ready to make that choice because he knows what he wants and just wants to keep trying to get to it. And after this, we get two great moments that I really love. First being how Debbie agrees to go on a date with her coworker, which shows how she's growing as a person and moving on from Nolan. And then next, as her and Mark talk about him and Amber's relationship, Mark hears the thoughts of what it was like for his mom dating his father. And Mark hears all of these things, and it makes him think if he wants to continue doing this to Amber, and makes him think if this relationship can even work, which we will see later. But for right now, he still wants to do better, to not put Amber in that position, to make the relationship so that what happened to his mom and his dad doesn't happen to their relationship. And so after this, Mark goes to Amber and he tells her about the deal that he made with Rex, in hopes to start making that progress to get their relationship in order. And they're having a great night together until
Mark Grayson, Invincible.
Anissa shows up. And as they fight, I like how she represents the easy way out for Mark, as she tells him all these things about humanity's flaws and weaknesses, and how Viltrum can stop all of this. And she inherently wants to do good as well. She believes in the way of Viltrum. She doesn't want the humans to die, but she also believes in the wrong side of the Viltrum ideology as well. And something else I love during this is how Cecil is telling Mark to say he'll do what she wants, and that will end the fight quicker, but Mark just won't do it. Saying those words to him is giving up, and if he submits, then he's no better than any Viltrumite, and it shows them that they are right, and it would show Anissa that Mark's ideology can just be broken so quickly, which would just make it look weak. And after this, we get one of my favorite moments in the entire show. As Mark tries to comfort Amber after the fight, they finally have that real conversation foreshadowed earlier, and she lets out all her true feelings. She wants to be here for Mark and be a part of his life and make this relationship work, but she feels lonely for months, weeks, and days at a time, and feels like when Mark constantly has to leave or do something, that her life doesn't matter that much in the grand scheme of stuff that is so much bigger. And now she realizes that she not only puts herself in danger by being close with him, but she can also be used as an emotional weapon that someone can use against Mark. And she knows that's not fair to put onto Mark, but she can't keep feeling this way. And Mark realizes that what he wants just won't work, no matter how hard he keeps trying. He acknowledges that he felt himself changing, and the parts of himself that is like his dad were bubbling up inside of him. And he thinks back to how his mom and dad's relationship was, and how Nolan telling Debbie everything will be fine at the end of the day was a lie, and he doesn't want to put that onto Amber. And so she asks, how does this work? And he just says, I don't know. And then directly after this, more of his loved ones are put in danger once again. And so here we go, episode 8, my favorite episode of the entire series. As the episode starts off, we see Sergeant Viltrumite trying to break Nolan once again, putting him into a small combat trial to make sure that he's up to code for inspection before he kills him. And after this, we have Mark and Angstrom's interaction. As more people Mark loves are in danger, his anger starts to build up. And the thing I like about Angstrom is how he represents what Mark could be if he went completely bad. Angstrom had an obsession with trying to save everyone, but when his memories merged with his other selves and became one, he is reminded of who Mark is in other dimensions, and that anger he has towards Mark due to all the tragic things that happened as a result of him in other universes, mixed with the fact that the chance to save everyone as well as his loved ones with this knowledge and power was stripped away by Mark, not just here but multiple times. This anger gets the better of Angstrom, and so he challenges that very thing that will break Mark, be it physically and or mentally. And when Debbie tells him that he's just mad that Mark is the one who is good here and he's the one who is bad, Angstrom snaps again, and this time both literally and figuratively, as he snaps Debbie's wrist. And as Mark gets increasingly tired of Angstrom's games, tired of his family being put in danger, seeing his mother's injury, Mark as well finally snaps.
Stop threatening my family! You have no idea what I've been through! How much I've been holding back!
And as Mark looks at his hands as he's beating on Angstrom, I love how this mirrors Omni-Man's hands when he was beating on Mark. And after this, he says to himself, "I thought you were stronger." And I like how this line can be interpreted in two different ways, both talking about himself and trying to cope with the fact that he just killed Angstrom. And we see him start to get delirious after this, trying to cope with what he just did, telling himself, "I had no choice. He was going to kill my family. He made me do it. I didn't want to do it. I had to kill him. I wanted to kill him. I lost control." Then we cut to Omni-Man as he's about to be prepped for his final days before being sentenced to death, and I love how he just says, "I accepted my fate long ago." But to get back to Mark, he starts to come to terms with what he did. He's not deluding himself about it anymore. And before leaving, this alternate dimension Eve tells Mark to tell his Eve how he feels about her, which we will get to in a bit. But as Mark gets back to his mom, he breaks down in emotion once again, and when talking to Cecil, he tries to communicate to Mark that he had to do it. There was no choice. He's not a bad person for what he did. And while these things are true, from Mark's perspective, this isn't the case. And he was scared of what he became, of how he lost control in that moment. He's scared of his power, and I just love the scene where he flies through the sky, reflecting on everything with his dad, and wanting to be just like him, and now becoming that person for a moment and being scared to be just like him. This is just so damn good. And he goes to check on Amber at college, and here, he makes that choice. And as he talks to his mom, we see that choice. He quits college because he realizes that trying to have a normal life right now won't work. Trying to be a normal person won't work, because he's not normal. He's scared of his power and he needs to be confident that he can control himself before any semblance of his life can be normal, and before he can move on from this fear. And even though the other Eve tells him that he needs to tell his Eve the truth about things and how he feels, he's just not ready to tell Eve. I love this arc. I thought it was fan-fucking-tastic. As someone who doesn't know anything about the comics, I was genuinely shocked how his arc played out. I was fully expecting Mark to confirm to himself by the end of this season that he wasn't like his dad, and he was going to continue on to get his personal life in order, but that's not what happened, and I'm glad it didn't, because while I think that still would have been good, it wouldn't have been as good as what we got. And moving on to the final scene I want to talk about is the final scene with Omni-Man. As he ponders his thoughts and regrets, Alan is trying to uplift him so that he can fight back against the Viltrumites. But Nolan is broken. He's fully accepted that the Viltrumite way is wrong. He feels sad and empathetic of all the things he's done, and he feels sad for the suffering of lesser beings. He knows and believes that he deserves death, and he's ready to accept that. And I love the final line that we get.
"I think I miss my wife."
The person who first showed him that there is good in humanity and helped him change. This show is fantastic. This season was fantastic. The character work that is done for Mark, Nolan, and Debbie is absolutely incredible, and I know I didn't talk about a lot of the other things that I could have, like Adam Eve, Cecil, the Guardians, but this video would have taken way longer to make if I had. But to quickly sum up my thoughts on them, it's all good to great. None of it is bad. And the things that I think are only just good literally pretty much just comes down to a product of the show not spending as much time on those things as it did others. And outside of one thing, maybe a little bit more with the Immortal and Kate, but I care for almost every single prominent character in this universe. Every plotline is interesting, and the world building is great as well. And so I give this show a 9.5 out of 10. And while yes, I have a couple issues, I think that all the greatness of this season makes up for all of the issues that I have, and it just makes them very minuscule in comparison. If you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you would support me on Patreon. It's only $2 a month. I hope you all enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think of this season in the comments, and yeah.